Speaking for the trees, no matter where they're from. The podcast.
So I wanted to start off with from your interview with Kelly. One of the things that you said that really made me sit up straight was that you said that you were talking about the overlap and the connection between the conservation movement and historically the eugenics movement. Mm-hmm. And you said that eugenics was conservation as applied to humans. Mm-hmm. And that I was just like, whoa, okay, mind blown. And part of this story was someone named Madison Grant. So mm-hmm. I just wanted to throw those two things out there as kind of a starting point, if you think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I mean, so that's something that coming from it from a perspective of conservation. So I didn't really know anything about eugenics up until a handful of years ago. It's not something that most of us are taught about. I think there's reasons for that, but yeah. So coming from it from the perspective of that, and then so essentially, I got interested in eugenics after reading about how some of the players in the conservation movement also existed in the eugenics movement. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was interesting, that there was overlap. And at the time I thought, well, maybe a product of the times. And I had just no idea how deep that rabbit hole was going to go when I started this research. So I think, I've come to the conclusion now after diving into different writings and trying to understand the frame of mind that both of these movements came from, and specifically trying to understand where the eugenics movement came from in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it's now clear to me that, like, if you actually look into the history of these topics, it's blatant. Like, I mean, I actually have some quotes. I can look through my notes and try to find some here but basically the players in the conservation movement were you can consistently find them across the board, conservation and eugenics. They were all the same people. It was an interlocking directorate of people in both of those movements. And they came right out and said this, that they were the same movement. Madison Grant is the one that I'm the most interested in studying, because he was essentially the one that I wouldn't say that he invented scientific racism, but he did bring all of the pieces together and present it in a scientific way. But it's not just Madison Grant, it's across the board. There's so many different conservationists who were at the forefront of the eugenics movement, and how they actually came right out and said, that that's what they were doing, that they were applying their background in wildlife management and zoology, and applying it anthropologically, applying it to humans. I mean, like I said, I have a number of quotes. So it's not just me, making assumptions about that. It's they came right out and said it on numerous occasions. Yeah, so I think they're the same. They have the same roots. They come from a lot of the same mentalities, the same kind of creed. And yeah, definitely. It's not just an overlap. They actually have the same root.
Right. Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, to take a critical look at conservationism as a movement, and to look at its history, and to look at some of the things that drive it, is not at all to say that that there are not places that need to be protected, and that there are not things right. that need to be saved, or anything like that. So mm-hmm. that's not the point of this conversation, is not to say that it should just be a free for all where we cut down all the trees and mine all the mountains. That's not the point of this either. It's more to point out how the priorities of those, how the overlapping priorities of conservationism and eugenics has led to some ideas that are still with us that are actually not helpful for protecting and saving different natural places and natural processes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we there's so many examples of that, right? I mean, we can take examples from history, we can take examples that are happening today. But even just looking at like Yosemite and what happened there, I frequently think about like what might have happened if the people who were involved in early conservation movements were not racist, were not white nationalists. How might things have been different? Would they have been able to have opened their minds to indigenous stewardship that was happening?
Right.
And this pattern is still happening all over the world. We still have conservation refugees being currently, created all over the planet still, because of that superiority mindset. So yeah, definitely not to say that we don't. Of course, I'm a huge advocate for like protecting spaces and tending spaces, but I think that conservation, because of the fact that it's born of the same perspectives, the same flawed perspectives, we really need to have more conversations about how that has played out into the conservation movement, and where maybe we've made some wrong turns and we're continuing to repeat mistakes, that we're part of the foundation of it. Yeah, so definitely think that we need to be dissecting this movement more than we have been, and doing it unapologetically.
Right. And I expect this conversation to take us around to invasive plants in particular, but maybe you could walk us through some of the history. For example, the Boone and Crockett Club and Madison Grant and some of these people, and just show us the connections that existed then.
So the Boone and Crockett Club was created as so it was created as a hunting club, a socialite hunting club. And it was created by Teddy Roosevelt, and a handful of other wealthy white male patricians. And the idea was, so hunting back in this point in time, I forget the year that it was founded, but it was in the early 1900s, right? Hunting was a really, really important aspect to maintaining status. So it was a really important part of that culture to do big game hunting and things like that. And the Boone and Crockett Club was created as an outlet for for them to share their stories and share their passion for hunting. But it was the idea was that I forget the exact quote of when it was founded, but one of Teddy Roosevelt's missions for that club was to promote like the manliest sport, right? It was supposed to be the most rigorous, manliest sport. And so it started off that way, and eventually, through the influence of a few of the members, primarily from my understanding, it seems like Madison Grant was one of the main members that pushed the Boone and Crockett Club beyond that scope into the scope of being a conservation organization. And from the research that I've done, I always believed that, like the Sierra Club and a couple other organizations were the early conservation organizations of this country. But it seems to me that the Boone and Crockett Club was actually the first organized thing that was going on, trying to work on conservation issues. So it morphed from one thing into several. It went through several different phases as the conservation movement changed, and as different branches of conservation kind of came about. And Madison Grant was one of, like I said, one of the big influencers. So kind of wherever Madison Grant went, it seemed like the Boone and Crockett Club kind of followed, even if other members kind of branched off into different aspects of conservation. So it branched into this conservation organization because it kind of morphed into that because there became a concern that what's going to happen if we don't preserve all these animals that we can hunt, right? What happens if they disappear? And if they disappear, then we lose our ability to maintain our status through this activity. So it was definitely a very like self-centered perspective. But again, as the conservation movement changed, some of those actors started to consider things more from a preservationist aspect, more from different aspects as far as like beyond just we want to be able to hunt animals, but also like we want to protect the landscape. We want to protect, old America as they saw it. And that also plays into this whole culture around eugenics, and in the fact that what they were trying to preserve and I believe this actually, there was a statement that came directly from Madison Grant to George Bird Grinnell, where he actually said that's what this is about, what both movements are about, is that they're about preserving old America. And so we can see those patterns play out in conservation. We can see those patterns play out as far as like trying to maintain the landscape of old America, meaning the America that existed prior to large immigration, but after the genocide of indigenous people, right? So that sweet spot, right, that everybody wanted at the time, all those white nationalists wanted, and idealized. And then, we also see that from the human perspective of we want just the nativist perspective, that nativism meaning that they not native as in indigenous Americans, but as in the old stock early colonial Americans, right? So we wanted to preserve that as well as part of the old America. And so there was a big fear around immigration and the changes that were happening in those couple of decades, as we saw mass influxes of immigration from different parts of the world, particularly Southern and Eastern Europe, and Asia. So the Boone and Crockett Club had lots and lots of different members, and if you look at the rosters for like the Boone and Crockett Club and all of the other conservation organizations that came about over the next like 2 decades in the US, there you see a lot of the same people. And a lot of those, like I said earlier, a lot of those same people are also on the roster for the American Eugenics Society and for all of the other organizations that came about around eugenics. So yeah, same people, same ideas. And from there, we see those people that were in the Boone and Crockett Club, we start to see them populate these other organizations and create them. The list of organizations that Madison Grant participated in is really long. I have it somewhere. It's very long, but he had his hands in virtually all of them. Yeah.
I think maybe some people haven't heard of the American Eugenics Society.
So maybe I should just start by defining like eugenics.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe we should just start there, so in case people don't actually know what that even is. Eugenics has been around for a really long time, right? At least since Sparta, right? That was something that was practiced. It's been practiced for a long time, and it's a global phenomena. But particularly in the late 1800s, early 1900s, eugenics was a big part of the culture in America, and it's what largely influenced Nazi Germany. Okay, so eugenics is this concept. Well, it's racial hygiene. And eugenics in the American eugenics movement was based on this concept that a particular white race, so that they called them the Nordics or the Aryans or the Teutons, the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, they all for that Northern white European, and the belief was that they were genetically superior. Okay, and it was an interesting time because you have Darwin had just released The Origin of the Species. We have Gregor Mendel is just coming out with these new ideas from his studies about how genetics are passed down. And so those two kind of new blossoming scientific movements were kind of hijacked to support racism and to give it what appeared to be a scientific basis. So eugenics was really about, and is still today about, how do we maintain racial purity, and how do we either prevent mixing of what were considered inferior races with a superior Nordic race, or in the extreme case of like how do we actually exterminate those people, or completely segregate them from our political boundaries, right? Like was done in Germany. So that's kind of that was the what was happening. That was the movement, and it wasn't a small movement. It was very much status quo. It was part of the big part of the culture, and there was a fear among the elite class, which primarily because of the way that class warfare often works out. The elite class were those, white Nordic wealthy males that were kind of ruling everything, running everything. There was a huge fear that they were going to become, their race was going to become diluted and deteriorate. And so eugenics came about as a way of maintaining that racial purity. And so we see a lot of different organizations that and political movements and things that came up as an effort to organize around this and actually create policy change. And so the American Eugenics Society Association was a product of that, but it wasn't the only one. We also have actually the Carnegie Genetics Department actually originated from basically it was this records office that was developed from I believe it was Rockefeller money that funded this. One of those the big bankers funded this this office. It was basically to gather surveys from people to try to prove that these things were being genetically handed down. So when we say genetic inheritance, we're not just talking about physical genetic inheritance. We're talking about there was this idea that intelligence was handed down genetically, that talent, that criminality, and then all kinds of physical things could be handed down through your genes. So it was like what I find interesting is the level of fear and terror that these people seem to be experiencing. Like if you read accounts and quotes from eugenicists, they were actually as afraid of racial extinction. And you could liken that to how people like you and I maybe feel today about the extinction of species around the globe and what that means for our outlook as humans and also just as a global society. So I think this fear of extinction is what kind of started that. And then so the actual organization had, like I said, there were a lot of different conservation members that were a part of it, but also people like John Harvey Kellogg and Luther Burbank and lots of different politicians and scientists and doctors, really profoundly influential people were part of that. And you see that, we saw that here in the United States. We also saw that in Germany in the Nuremberg trials, because every single one of the scientists and doctors that were put on trial all pleaded not guilty. Right? They truly believed that they were acting in a way that would protect what they perceived to be their people, right? So that was the perspective at least that was the perspective of, like I said, the elite class. The thing was that the modern or the average person of that time that wasn't part of the elite class didn't necessarily care too much about any of this stuff. So what these eugenics organizations and the policymakers were trying to do was they were trying to propagandize and change the opinion of the American people to scare them into thinking that they needed to be, careful about racial mixing and needed to preserve themselves if they were of this supposed Nordic race.
Right.
Yeah.
And if any of this sounds familiar to people listening now, it's because some of these ideas are still out there. I mean, replacement theory or great replacement theory, you know, that the big one that's being pushed the last few years, that, you know, white America is going to be overcome, you know, by immigrants. I mean, it's the same. It's the same thing.
It is the same. There was so Jeff Sessions just a couple of years ago made that statement about the 1924 Immigration Act, saying that, you know, this has happened once before, and that's when the Immigration Restriction Act was put into place. And it really he was kind of acting like it really solved things for us. The Immigration Restriction Act was put into place literally because scientific racism had momentum. And Madison Grant didn't write that bill, but he was credited with all of the foundation that they needed to make that pass. And the Immigration Restriction Act prevented all Asians, and it limited Southern and Eastern Europeans from immigrating. So it was a huge, and we haven't really recovered from that since then. I mean, immigration to the US has always been altered since then. It's never been anything close to what it was before that. So we have modern politicians today still saying that we need to follow what they did back in the 1920s to prevent this immigration catastrophe that's happening, because we're it's still that mindset of fear, right? Of not just immigration, but specifically of immigration from certain types of people, and specifically non-white, non-English speaking people. So yeah, and I mean, there's plenty of evidence all around that we know the white supremacy is still rampant, and we know we can see it in every day in the way that policy making, but also like where I live in a very conservative area. The interactions that I have on a daily basis have confirmed for me that this is still a huge problem. Just perfect evidence of like these politicians are actually basing their decisions on these exact same laws that were put into place that were horrific. Yeah.
Right. So kind of to sum up, eugenics as a philosophy or a movement was behind several things that happened. And among those things were limiting immigration, were segregation, keeping people separate. So the whole set of Jim Crow laws, and then I know that there was forced sterilization that happened also of people not considered to be of the proper race, and then Germany sort of picked up on all of this and took it to the extreme that they did, which is actually just exterminating people openly. Although extermination has happened here in the United States, as well, obviously. And when you were talking to Kelly, you talked about 3 tenets of conservation that are shared as tenets of eugenics. And those 3 tenets were typology, deterioration, and invasive species.
So the three tenets, those came, my understanding, those came directly from Madison Grant. Okay. So typology, again, so it's this idea that within a species, there are different types of people or different types of mammals or different types of plants, and some of which are robust and healthy and intelligent or superior in some way, and others may be different or less so. And so when applied to people, this is scientific racism. Okay, so when we apply this to people, that's what that is. That's what it comes from. And so with human beings, they were measuring. They were doing actual measurements of people, of their bodies, to figure out what type they fit into. And then they were also basing it on, a history of, do they have a lot of talent in their ancestral lineage? What is their intelligence level? The IQ test has a pretty interesting and dark history, and was used to measure intelligence and for this typology purpose to be able to figure out where a person fits, because sometimes it's difficult, right? Because race doesn't totally, it doesn't actually exist. But anyway, so yeah, so back to the conservation tenets. You can start to see it's not an imaginary overlap, right? I mean, like they're exactly identical in so many different ways, eugenics and conservation, because like I said, they're literally taking the education. These people were literally taking the education that they had and their observations and the work that they were doing around specifically, primarily wildlife management, but also things like plant cultivation, and applying that directly to humans. And then they came up with these tenets. Yeah.
Right. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, it's just amazing to really fully understand that we shape our concepts about ourselves, our societies, and our world, the rest of the natural world, from a certain perspective. that it doesn't happen in a box,
right?
That where we decide what our science means comes from the way in which we've been looking at it. And it's just occurring to me more and more as time goes on, looking at these subjects for so long, that we're going to treat the world around us how we treat ourselves and each other. Like those things don't happen on their own. And something that was occurring to me in listening to you giving the history of human eugenics, and well, a couple of things came up. One was that that our idea of conservation today kind of takes humans out of the picture, sometimes with very violent upheaval and displacement of the people who are living there in those places. And so it's this idea of removal of humans, but the basis for conservation came from certain humans using that place for wildlife. So it's kind of this like double standard that's been there since the beginning too. And the other part was that a lot of the conservation stuff now is trying to go back to that sweet spot. And I've thought about it before, that a part of why that sweet spot holds a lot of pull for people is there's a sense of guilt that, like, wow, there was a lot of genocide and disruption to indigenous folks here. And there's a certain feeling in people that they'd like to put it back how it was, to pay respect to how something was. But it's a funny one, because there's also that other aspect of when conservation was born, it was a place of, well, a colonized idea of old America, not a new one, So that one's even flawed, even trying to come from a like heartfelt place of like feeling all the grief of all the shit that's happened. It's like, that's still maybe the wrong placement, for those things. And I'm sure we'll get into this more, but this stuff is also heavy. Like I feel that a lot. It was just like, we have to change the way we look at how we relate with the world and with each other. It really is all relational, and the typology, the deterioration, and the invasive species is all, those things only hold up from removal from relationship with the things around it. Otherwise they don't make any sense. Like you have to throw out the process of evolution itself in order to have those tenets hold up, like the process of remembering that we came up with the idea of a species, but the process of speciation would be, a pool of genetics in a certain environment responding and expressing in response to that environment over time. And then you have seed banks laid down, and you have certain seeds that can germinate because conditions were just right. And so those ones lay down another layer, and then conditions change. And then there's, we don't actually understand that much about seed banks, referring to plants, but like, and then they get isolated, and then you start to have different species who are expressing uniquely to that place over time. But at a certain point, different disturbances or movements happen. And then it's the divergent evolution again, which like reinvigorates it. Like when we were, farming was the land race thing. How do you reinvigorate something that's gotten too small to be able to have all the expressions it might need, So those are all like I guess just aspects of why I feel like these subjects are so important. You can choose it from the human perspective or from a plant perspective or a wildlife biology perspective, and be like, we have to reconsider how the shape of how we're looking at things.
Yeah.
Because we might be shooting the whole process of adaptability when we really need it.
Right.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is also a blog at kolibri.substack.com. That's KOLLIBRI.substack.com. Paid subscribers get exclusive blog posts and early access to podcast episodes. Intro beats by Big Joe Drummer. This outro music by Codebox. Join us again for another episode of Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast.